everybody for coming. I'm super excited about this one. I've been looking forward to ever since Stuart volunteered at the end of the last meetup last month. So we'll go over a couple quick things and I can give most of the time to Stuart. I think that's the interesting stuff. We do have our jobs board on Forge Utah Slack and all sorts of other stuff on there. So if you're not on there, I highly recommend you get on there. I think almost every single person here is already, but here it is. There's two places if you want to speak, really three, right? There's paper call for women who go, but it also gets fed into this. There's the, well, that should be the dedicated channel for call for presenters. That's wrong on there. And the other way is to just stick around after we're done, and we'll just, and if you want to talk, we'll talk about it. So it's pretty, you don't have to go through a whole formal process. If you have an idea, just post to it to anybody that'll listen, and we'll get you through the fun. So, like I said, I'm not going to spend some time. That's pretty much the whole thing since Go West is now over. That was a huge success. So thanks for everybody. I look forward to what we get to do next year. And I guess the Google Gopher Conference is coming up in 6 weeks, according to my latest email.
It's Gopher Academy. Google not all.
Okay, well, anyway, the big Go conference.
Gopher Common.
All online, all free. So if you're curious, that's a great place to start. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to hand it over to Stuart, who is, I don't know if I've ever seen him speak here before, but he always sticks around at the end, and he always, during and after every single meetup I've seen him, has really smart things to say about just about everything. I'm really excited and really confident for him. So Stuart, go ahead and take it away.
Just to confirm, I think I heard you say that you've already started the recording?
Yes, I have.
Perfect. And hopefully everybody can see the first slide of my first slide of my presentation.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay. So UI options for CLI apps. As I'm sure everybody is already aware, CLI is the command line interface. Often we also talk about the terminal, the text screen that you log into. And before I start diving into the really fun stuff, being able to have graphical widgets in the terminal, I do want to take a moment to step back and remind everybody that a really important part of your user interface when you're creating command line applications is the arguments that your application takes. And I've gone through and listed some of the most popular third-party solutions for adding command line parsing. I want to call a special attention to Kong. I've added the gold star next to it because it's currently my personal favorite. Many people have used Kingpin. It's been adopted by some very large open source projects, but Kingpin's maintainer decided that he was not happy with the interface and has effectively stopped maintaining the application, maintaining the library, and instead using Kong. I miss some things about Kingpin, but Kong is a really nice library, so if you're trying to pick your own favorite, definitely check it out. Now, when you're working on the command line, it's really nice sometimes to present a prompt to the user and ask them for input in a nice, editable way, complete with command line history so that they can up arrow to bring back old input. If you've ever done C programming, you will recognize readline as the most common library for handling this. However, in the Go world, readline is actually a pretty old, kind of outdated library, and these days I would recommend checking out liner instead. So let's talk about some common tools that you might find useful when you're building more advanced command line applications than just asking for some simple input or reading some command line args. Starting with Rook Width. This is a library that you will discover almost all of the fun stuff is using either directly or indirectly through its dependencies. As you might guess from the name, you give it a string and it tells you how many character spaces it'll take on the terminal. This is especially important if you're trying to create widgets, things like windows and buttons and scrolling lists and so on. Unfortunately, it's never 100%. So if you start going crazy trying to use Asian languages or some of the less common used parts of Unicode, it's not always going to work perfectly, but it's going to work a whole lot better than if you just use the Go standard library. And then, of course, sometimes it's nice to interact with the clipboard. Add something to the clipboard, copy it off of the clipboard, and we've got a nice cross-platform library available for doing that. Maybe you want to print some data in a nice tabulated form. Now, notice that this is just going to print it directly to standard out, nothing fancy. We're going to get into the more fancy tables later in the presentation, but sometimes simple and quick is the answer, so good to know about. Now, if you're going to build a really well-integrated application, it's important to put your files in the right place. Do you want to have a user config file? Or do you want to have a system-wide config file? The correct location for that is going to be different depending on if you're on Mac OS, Windows, or one of the different Linux variants. Same thing for your cache data, your log data, or just general data that your application might depend on. So Go App Paths will help you to do that in a more cross-platform friendly way, following the standards for each platform. And here's another one that you're going to find as a dependency in a lot of the more advanced terminal applications. Fatigue Color, just guessing at how to pronounce that username, is everywhere. It supports all of your standard ANSI behavior, foreground colors, background colors, bolding, underlining, blink, etc. But at this point, it's actually not as interesting as it used to be. As a result of doing this presentation, I refreshed my knowledge of terminal libraries, and I discovered that things have been advanced in the last couple of years. So out of China, we have GooKit Color, which on Windows especially is going to give you some really nice support. On both Unix and Windows, it has not only the standard 16 ANSI colors, but it has a 256 color interface, and you can even give it just hex colors, as well as give it strings containing pseudo HTML, so that you can wrap your warnings in red tags, and it'll handle rendering it in the right color for you. But there's an even better alternative, TermEnv. It also has support for not just 16-bit ANSI colors, but 256 color palettes and RGB. But it also lets you do things like enter alt screen. So maybe you've noticed that when you use certain programs like less, it temporarily takes over your entire terminal. And then when you close the program, you get your old command prompt back, and it hasn't messed up your scroll history because it was working in an alternate screen. TermEnv makes this easier for you. It has support for moving the cursor around the screen so that you can do things like drawing lines and creating your own framework of widgets, buttons, scroll bars, all that kind of stuff. And it has support for the mouse. I have not personally used TermEnv or GooKit Color, but we're going to talk more about one of the things that TermEnv enables much later, which is really exciting. For those that want to jump ahead, BubbleTea is the great discovery of this presentation. But before we get to the end of the presentation, let's talk again about some foundational libraries. A TTY is the device file that you use to talk to the terminal. And TTYs can be in effectively two states. They can be in an interactive state with a human attached, which is a good time to display things like buttons and forms and scroll bars and all those sorts of fun things. Or it could be that your application is not connected to a TTY, but standard in and standard out are just part of a pipe because you are being executed inside of somebody else's script. It's really important for more advanced applications to be able to detect this and act appropriately. If you're inside of a script, you don't want to present a question to the user and wait for them to fill in a form because there's no user present to fill in that form. You're either going to get some garbage data or you're just going to hang forever, neither of which are really good user experiences. So using is a TTY, you can basically ask, is my standard in and standard out connected to a human or connected to a script? And the common thing to do if you are not connected to a human is to have a default behavior. Try and be as useful as possible so that you are easy to use inside of a script. But depending on what application you're building, it is alternatively appropriate to just quit and refuse to run. If you've ever tried to use Vim inside of a shell script, this is often what Vim will do when it detects it's not attached to a TTY. Of course, that can be annoying if you are the one that is trying to script a program that expects to have a TTY so that it can present some type of user interface to interact with. So if you're ever writing a Go program that needs to wrap another command line application that does have a command line user interface or a text user interface, PTY lets you create a pseudo TTY. And then just like the screen, or not the screen command, just like the expect command from old school Unix, you can actually watch for it to try and prompt you for input, and then you can provide that input in order to automate the program that you want to work with. Okay. So those are some common libraries that are good to have in your back pocket when you're trying to build a really nice, friendly command line application. But now let's talk about the real fun, text user interfaces. And we're going to start in more or less a historical order. TermBoxGo. I don't want to be too disrespectful when I say that this is an old and busted library because it's still widely used. It's the first library that I actually used when I decided to try and create a more interesting command line application. I, at this point, though, cannot in good conscience recommend using TermBoxGo. We have much better options available today. But let's talk about some of the things that it made possible. TermUI. I remember when I first saw this, I was really impressed. It's got simple widgets already built for you. So if you want a text box or a series of text boxes to create a form to prompt your user for input, it's got you covered. But not only that, it can actually draw charts on the command line. Let me just double check. Yep, this is one of the animated examples. So you can actually see what that would look like as it's presenting data to your users or allowing them to select an option from a list. Again, though, although you will still see this being used in some open source projects, I can't recommend using TermUI anymore. Along similar lines, GhostUI is based on Termbox. It's a little bit younger than TermUI. It's got some slightly more interesting features. For example, it has the ability to display windows that overlap each other. So each of those frames there are effectively like a window. In the old school, Windows 1.0 style, where they couldn't overlap, but GhostUI is actually more advanced than that. It's one of the few libraries you'll find that has support for overlapping windows in a terminal program. So I said that I can't recommend TermBoxGo. A much better option that I have more experience using is T-Cell. Although honestly, I have not used T-Cell directly. The majority of my experience has been using TView, which is widgets that are built on top of T-Cell. So this is a text box, scrollable text view, lists where you can select items in the list. You can notice along the bottom there that you can build effectively tabs, and you have support for scrollable data tables. TView is occasionally a little bit awkward, but until I started doing some research for this presentation, it was going to be my recommendation because it's a pretty nice full-featured library. It's been around for quite a while. It's pretty robust. Although, like I said, I can't necessarily recommend it anymore because as a result of doing this presentation, I went out to refresh my knowledge and I discovered things have moved along nicely since then. So, for example, we saw TermUI with its support for charts in the interface. These days, instead of TermUI, I would recommend using TermDash. As you can see, it's a little bit prettier, and the code has had more of an emphasis on cleanliness and testability. I have not personally built anything with TermDash, but if I needed to put charts up on the terminal, this is definitely the library that I would use today. Just demonstrate a little bit of it in motion there. And now we come to PTerm. And this one is not animated. PTerm is actually, instead of the common theme of being built on Termbox or T-Cell, basically built on from scratch with minimal dependencies. It's a really impressive piece of work, but still quite young. It's only a little more than a year old based on Git history, but it's being very actively updated and maintained. Has a very nice GitHub page with lots of examples, lots of different widgets, text input, buttons, scrollable lists, all those nice sorts of things. And it has had a large number of contributors. So if I were picking a library to base things on today, this would be given serious consideration. I, again, unfortunately haven't had an opportunity to build anything with it. I wish I'd been able to find that time before today to create even a little toy application. But all I've done is just play with the example code and prove to myself, yep, it compiles and it's not a bad interface. Well, unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying this is what I would definitely use today, because we have another good option available to us. Maybe that's not unfortunately, maybe that's good news. In addition to PTerm, the other framework that I would give serious consideration today is BubbleTea by CharmBracelet. And this one should be animated. Yep, there we go. Go ahead and start animating. So again, it has supports for some basic things. Text inputs, scroll bars, buttons, progress bars. I really wanted to create some test code for this. It's a little bit older than PTerm. Also actively maintained. It's about 2 years old based on Git history. The one advantage or disadvantage that it has going for it is that CharmBracelet is actually using this at the core of a product for a startup. And the business model for the startup is a bit curious. It seems to be focused on terminal-based document management with some sort of security angle to the way that they give you access to your documents. Honestly, I am a little dubious. If I understand what they're trying to build a startup around, I really wonder if they're going to be around for the long term. But they've managed to last 2 years so far. And if the library is popular enough, it could be around for the long term. This is why I would also give serious consideration to PTerm, because just based on the number of outside contributors, PTerm looks like a healthier project, but BubbleTea is definitely the prettier, fancier, more advanced library. So if you don't mind just a little bit of risk, BubbleTea is maybe where to start. And we saw that BubbleTea had some basic functionality, but on top of that, there's another library called Bubbles that gives you even more widgets. So we've got things like support for data tables and even Markdown. That currying artichokes there is actually colorized Markdown. And you can see at the bottom that they're using the bottom line of the screen for navigation inside of the application. Don't think, oh yes, this one is animated also, so you can see kind of what all of that is capable of. So we saw it actually doing live filtering of lists and selecting items from a list and scrolling through a text document that has actually been marked up with Markdown, pop-up menu from the bottom, a lot of really nice advanced features for creating a pleasant text user interface. But CharmBracelet doesn't stop there. They've got an interesting other library, Lipgloss. And when I look at Lipgloss, I basically think of it as CSS for the terminal. The interesting thing about Lipgloss is that although it is intended for use with BubbleTea, it's not necessarily limited to use with BubbleTea. I looked at some other command line applications as I was doing a survey of all of the available options, and I actually found Lipgloss integrated with, I think it was a TView based view. So where you would normally see somebody using, for example, GooKit Color, that really common one, I did find one use of Lipgloss instead, a really odd combination of an old TUI framework with a really new color library. You might remember back to when we talked about TermEnv. TermEnv is effectively the foundation used for creating BubbleTea. So what that really means is that CharmBracelet, either directly as part of their corporate GitHub or indirectly through employees that maintain important libraries like TermEnv, is responsible for at least 4, actually 5, because I left one of them out, 5 really interesting TUI libraries. And that was a short presentation. I can try and answer some application or some questions. Unfortunately, Carson was wrong about me not presenting before. Last time I presented, I made the mistake of trying to squeeze way too much information into the presentation. And this time I've gone through it much faster than last time. Probably this option was better. Any questions?
Stuart, were you there when Carson presented for 2.5 hours?
Which time?
I was not, but I probably would have if I'd been allowed.
It was Kubernetes. We were an hour and a half in. Finally, I got up and said, "Hey, if anyone needs to go home, you can go. It's okay." And no one left. Everyone stayed the whole time. It was that good.
That was a few weeks
Nice.
ago.
Yeah. So what do you find, how do you get data into these, generally speaking, how do you get data into these frameworks? Is it calling functions and how, like these are dynamic interfaces. Is it a lot of channel work? Like I'm curious about how you bind data to the UI.
Right, so unfortunately, like I said, I didn't get a chance to play with BubbleTea and PTerm as much as I would have liked to. So I can really only speak in terms of TView. But I expect that it is going to be largely the same for all of them. My experience was just like most graphical interface libraries, TView is effectively single-threaded. So you need to, if you want to put multi-threading, interactive behavior on top of it, you need to have one dedicated Go routine that's responsible for managing your interface, and then taking any input from the user and passing that off to any other Go routines that you want to have processing it. So the most common use case is simply that you put together a form, throw it up on the screen, and give them the ability to navigate between the different form fields, which is mostly automatic. In TView, you would basically just create the different widgets, effectively stacking them inside of boxes, like HTML 0.5 kind of, but in using method calls, and then you hand it off to its event loop, and just have one of the parts of your form be a button, like an OK or a cancel button, and it'll hand control back to you at the end of the event loop, at which point you can hopefully have captured all of your data and can start processing it and execute and then end. But if you wanted to do something fancy, like we saw the BubbleTea example of where you're showing a document and letting them scroll around inside of the interface and so on, you effectively have to take that event loop and, like I said, give it its own dedicated Go routine, and then write your it's effectively callback handlers in such a way that they have access to a channel so they can pass the data over to other Go routines. Yeah, if you've done any GUI-based programming, it feels very similar, where you've got to have that event loop being handled, and all of the other code, and the library is going to handle that event loop for you in a nice, pleasant way. But as soon as you need to do multi-threaded work, your life gets harder.
Okay. So it's not, I figured it's probably something with that, or maybe first-class functions. You pass a lot of functions around to do things. There's response, like there's more synchronous, like it would, like front end would be.
Yeah. So when I say callback handlers, that can be first-class functions, object methods, all of the normal tricks that you'd use in Go. But the important thing is that you can't, at least with TView and probably with the others, you can't update the UI from anything other than the Go routine that is executing the event loop.
Okay. That makes sense. What do you find your hardest, like, if you're gonna, it sounds like you built at least a few of these. where do you get blocked? Like if I feels like a lot to just go start building one of these. It feels overwhelming. Like, how do you get started, and where do you think I'm gonna like hit my first wall?
Well, so there's two reasons that I didn't get a chance to play with the new libraries. One of them was obviously just life and being busy with other stuff, but the other one was exactly that problem of I'm not a UI designer and I'm not a product manager, so I'm less used to stepping back and saying, here are my objectives, let's design an interface for it. And once I have that interface, I find that that's 50% of what blocks me, is just deciding what should the user interaction look like. And then I can start, chipping away at the code like you would on the other application, implementing part of it, testing it, confirming it works, and implementing the next part. So that's half of what's blocking me. The other half would be simply all of these give you basic widgets, text foils, buttons, the ability to scroll through a list and select an item. And honestly, most of those things you can accomplish just using CLI args. So I would be more inclined to create an arg-based interface instead of presenting the user with a form. When I decide that I do need a real text-based user interface, it's usually because there's some behavior above and beyond that I'm trying to accomplish. So for example, the most advanced thing that I used this for was to create effectively a process tool. I'm trying to think now. In Heroku, you can define a collection of programs that should be run together as a unit, and there's a name for that.
Pod.
Oh. Well, no, not a pod. This predates pods and Kubernetes and all that kind of fun stuff.
I know in Heroku.
It's the metaphor is actually like a construction worker. Anyway, I wanted something like that, where you have a simple text file that defines, I want Nginx running, and I want to have this Go program running, and I want to have Redis running, and start them all at the same time. But I didn't like the common behavior where the output from all of those programs would just be mixed together with a label, because it made it much harder to kind of see the behavior of my applications. I wanted to split the screen up into panes where I would have, the Nginx logs at the top and the Redis logs in the middle, and my Go applications logs at the bottom of the screen. But I didn't want to have to, like start tmux and then manually start each of those programs on their own or so on. I wanted it to be a unified program that I could hand off to my coworkers and just say, run this single command. It'll bring up your development environment. You can see the logs from the programs. And just figuring out how to get all of that working to capture the output of the programs, each one in its own dedicated Go routine, pass that data to a central coordinating Go routine that could then hand it off to the UI in a thread safe way or a Go routine safe way, however you want to put it, was really the other 50% of the challenge is, kind of creating that custom widget and all of the fun that comes from having to use Go channels instead of being able to rely on a library and having to coordinate the interaction between all the different Go routines.
Okay, makes sense.
Did you actually build that app that you just described?
I would say that I built 90% of it. I never got it as far as being brave enough to hand it off to my coworkers to use.
Which of the libraries that we talked about today did you using for that?
I used TView for it.
Okay.
With PTY for capturing some of the output. to simulate it like there was an actual human being at the screen watching the logs instead of having them fall back to their black and white, regular interface. It's actually available on my GitHub, although it's in my messiest project called Mecha, which has been kind of my playground for working with lots of different interesting libraries. So I can link to that in the Golang Slack channel. I'm also planning on sharing my slides in the Golang Slack channel for those that weren't able to write down any of the interesting URLs as I was displaying them.
I kind of want a cheat sheet, actually. I want Stuart's cheat sheet of TUI tools, just full of those, because I think that's a lot of research that's hard to do. Do any of these have testing? Do any of these have ways to do unit tests against the UI? I find that to be kind of a tricky part to test against.
That's an interesting question. No, TView didn't have a standard way of testing, and although I like to try and get as much test coverage as I can, I never came up with a really good way to test it. But let me see here. I'm looking through the list of libraries. TermDash, if I remember correctly. Let me just pull this up quickly. I believe TermDash was the one that lists test coverage among its project goals. So if you wanted to see how that's implemented, no, maybe it wasn't TermDash. It is prominently listed in the kind of distinguishing characteristics for the project. I thought that was there we go. PTerm says well tested. PTerm has 100% test coverage, which means that every line of code inside PTerm gets tested automatically. So PTerm would be a really interesting place to look and see how did they do that, because honestly, I don't know how you test a TUI framework well.
I have no idea either. I think my instinct would be to separate all the important stuff out and just turn it into a separate way to get input. But it'd be cool if we could actually unit test that. Integration test, rather. Anybody else have any questions?
How resilient are these libraries? So terminals come in a lot of shapes and forms and fashions. You mentioned cross-platform on some of them, but if you have users that are going to have varying sizes, are they helping with that? Are they, end cursors were more just putting blocks on screens and letting you scroll through them. As you get through widgets, do they actually have the ability to resize dynamically like you might expect on web design? Or are you going to kind of have to assume, well, if your screen isn't this wide, it's going to look funny, or if you increase the font size of your text, it's going to roll over and cause problems?
Mobile first CLI design.
Yeah.
So again, I can mostly speak to the older ones, and this is again one of the areas where TView was nicer than TermBox. You do lay out kind of like when you're building a web page where you have different boxes, and then you can either attach a resize signal handler and pick the size yourself, or you can just, with some of the libraries, you can tell it, I want this to be always 20 characters width, and then the column next to it should take the remaining available space. Or you can tell each of them, I want you to take 50% of the space. In the old libraries that I worked with, I would say that worked 95% of the time. In normal usage, I rarely saw a problem. They would do a good job of resize handling for you if you picked the right widget and you laid them out the right way. But if I really tried to stress test it, it wasn't too hard for me to resize it quickly enough or so on to kind of cause some drawing problems. And then the other thing, remember going back to rune width, as soon as I started throwing interesting Unicode characters at it, emoji, for example, often wanting to take more than a single character space for their rendering, it was obvious that some widgets had accidentally or deliberately been better designed to handle I'm trying to think what would be the right term for, basically for characters that were wider than a single letter on the screen. If they wanted to take up 2 spaces for their rendering, sometimes some widgets would handle it perfectly and other widgets would get completely broken. I would expect that the 2 more modern libraries, PTerm and BubbleTea, handle that better. Both of them tout their cross-platform support, so I expect that to be better. But I haven't tested them, so I can't promise you that they do it better. But in my experience, all of the libraries that we talked about, TermBox, TView, were less painful to use than Curses was.
And does that mean they are all still rendering lines of text, or are they using a different mode to be able to do more advanced things? Like, is it similar to ASCII art that's doing just much fancier things than what the ASCII art renders do?
It is effectively ASCII art, but you'll remember that that even back in the days of the early VT 220s and so on, well, okay, actually, we shouldn't say ASCII art because that actually implies that you're limited to the ASCII character set. Most of them have the ability to take advantage of the more advanced characters that are actually used for line drawing. If you're familiar with Midnight Commander, and Curses also actually kind of had this, the additional characters that could be used for line drawing, a vertical line, a corner, a horizontal line, very basic drawing was possible, not just ASCII characters.
Any of them render images?
No. Most terminals don't have support for drawing images. Fish, I think, might, but I've never personally used Fish, so I can't speak more to how in the world it implements the ability to embed an image in the middle of your terminal output. So.
Some of them are gaining it, but I don't think there's any like unified way to do it. So.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap it up here, and then we can keep hanging out afterwards. We'll close the official recording, everything. So.